and welcome to another fabulous episode of Thyroid Refresh TV, a podcast dedicated to helping you live a thyroid healthy lifestyle. We're so very glad to be back with you again. I'm Danna Bowman.
I'm Ginny Mahar, and we are the dynamic duo behind Thyroid Refresh and Thyroid 30. And we're thrilled to be here today once again with licensed acupuncturist, gut and hormone specialist Brie Wieselman to talk about gut health testing. How do we figure out what's going on in our gut? So this is going to be a juicy topic to talk about. I know this is something our community is very curious about, and gut health issues can be really difficult to diagnose. So this is going to be some empowering information for us to know about when we're having gut issues. So welcome, Brie. Thanks so much for joining us.
Thanks for having me, ladies. It's wonderful to be back with you and your community.
Before we dive in, let me tell you guys a little bit about Brie. She's a functional medicine practitioner, digestive health and hormone balance specialist, working with women around the world in her online practice. Besides women's health, she also specializes in helping people with digestive problems such as IBS, parasitic infections, Candida overgrowth, and Sibo to rebuild a bulletproof microbiome. Using her programs that integrate functional medicine and Chinese medicine approaches, she has worked with hundreds of clients living anywhere from Dubai to New Zealand to California, empowering them with a personalized roadmap for understanding and transforming their health. Dubai, wow, cool.
Yeah.
Over.
I want a bulletproof microbiome.
Me too.
Yeah. Well, some of you may remember we talked to Brie a while back. We didn't realize how long it had been, but it sounds like it's been maybe even a couple of years now. And we talked to Brie about some exciting new ways to manage and treat gut dysbiosis, including helminth therapy, which is worm therapy, which was fascinating and really exciting to hear about some of the research behind that. Definitely expanded my thinking on, what I might be willing to do if I were having some serious gut issues. But that's another great episode you guys can check out if you're interested in learning more. But of course, today we really want to talk about stool testing.
Woohoo! What a fun topic.
Yeah. Number 2, poo testing. So this is something I know can make us a little squirmy. I mean, and, even just the idea of it can be, I don't know, just
uncomfortable.
A little uncomfortable for people. You got to collect a sample. I mean, sometimes you have to walk into the lab with your paper bag, or I've done ones at home where you just mail the whole thing in, and there's lots of different ways and forms, packages that this comes in. So we're excited to learn about some of those today. But Brie, I was wondering if maybe we could start with just covering what can stool testing tell us about the gut, or maybe even about other health issues.
Sure. That's a great place to start. And I'm giggling to myself because before we dive into that, just you're, mentioning that of course it's a squeamish thing to talk about testing our stool. And, when people haven't done that before, sometimes it's like, oh my gosh, like, am I gonna, have to send the whole thing in? And, just to put people's minds at ease, it's usually a teeny tiny little like smear or a sample. Some of the more modern kits are even just like you rub a little bristle brush on a piece of toilet paper that you use to wipe, to get specific. But it's usually nowhere near as traumatic as what people initially imagine it might be to actually collect a stool sample.
Yeah, so, I would agree with that. It wasn't, when I did it, it wasn't as bad as I thought it might be in my imagination. So thank you for mentioning that and clearing that up.
Yeah. So, I mean, we can learn so much from the stool, and what we can learn from a stool sample is evolving every day. I mean, even just in current times, there's a whole bunch going on with other kinds of stool testing and things around COVID-19, and that is pretty cool. So anyway, without diving into that, what like general stool testing that we use clinically can tell us kind of falls into a couple categories. There's digestive function. So, how your gut and is working, how digestion, absorption, and the factors that influence it are or are not working. We can get assessments of intestinal inflammation. And then we can assess the intestinal microbiome, meaning the healthy organisms and desirable ones, and kind of who's living there and how many, and also infectious or pathogenic organisms. So those are kind of the main categories. So to go a little bit further, so in the realm of, let's first talk about inflammation and immune. So there's a couple of main markers that we would look at. So just to mention a little bit about what each of these means. And of course, not every stool panel is going to contain all of these markers, but the different panels out there will have a different array of them. So some really specific markers that you'll see on most tests, one's called Calprotectin, and that's a sensitive marker of inflammation. And one of the main uses for that is to differentiate when someone's having inflammatory bowel disease, like Crohn's or ulcerative colitis are two main examples of what inflammatory bowel disease is, versus an IBS or irritable bowel syndrome or other digestive syndrome. And so the reason we want to know that is that you can have similar symptoms. And so we want to know if there's a high risk of someone having an autoimmune condition or an inflammatory bowel condition that might eventually predispose someone to being at higher risk for certain pathologies like certain cancers. So we use the numbers to kind of, there's a range of numbers that will tell us if infection is suggested, or perhaps if there's kind of low key inflammation, maybe from something like chronic NSAID use, or if it's a really high level above a certain range, we'll then suspect inflammatory bowel disease, or even, go to have something ruled out like that, or even in rare cases, colorectal cancer. So we can tell based on the range that those numbers fall into kind of what the risk is and what it's probably telling us. And there's other markers of inflammation as well.
Are the markers all included in are there different levels of testing, what do you normally order for people?
Yeah, well, so really what happens is that there's certain stool panels that are offered by different
Panels, that's the word I was looking for. Thank you.
Panels. And the panel is just a collection of markers that and assessments. And most of the stool panels you order are kind of they are what they are. They're a set. When you're ordering from at least a specific company, the way I do, they're going to come with this is what the test contains, and it's going to have different sections usually for some of these functional markers, and then also for pathogens and like that. Some of the tests you can order in chunks, like you could only order the pathology section, maybe, but for the most part you order the whole panel. The different markers where you get into ordering individual markers, that's going to be more when you go work with an allopathic physician or medical group and you're ordering a stool calprotectin. You can definitely order that as a single marker through that medical group's labs or LabCorp Quest, that kind of thing. But for the most part, what we're talking about is there's some main companies that are the popular ones available in the functional medicine space or online, naturopathic wellness space. And so the one that I happen to use the most right now and for a while has been the GI Maps by Diagnostic Solutions. It's a great panel and very cutting edge at the time that it launched, and still is very competitive. There's some other competitors that it's kind of just who you prefer and why. And the world of stool testing is constantly evolving. So I think any company that's, kind of worth its, what is that phrase, worth its metal or whatever, they're always kind of evolving the way they run their panel, or at least what it contains, or how they, coach practitioners on using that. So, but
Okay.
Calprotectin is usually one of those markers that's included in most general stool panels.
Okay. I was wondering if leaky gut is something that is indicated on a stool panel.
Yeah, that was the next marker I was going to talk about, is related to that. So under the category of inflammation and immune, one of the main markers that's used is called zonulin. And that is a marker of leaky gut. If it's high, if it's elevated, it has to do with certain proteins in the junctions between the cells. And so that can be a reflection of leaky gut. But one thing that's important to know is it's not the only marker of leaky gut. And so we can actually have leaky gut, some degree of leaky gut, and not have an elevated zonulin. So if it's positive, it's a confirmation. If it's negative and you still suspect it, it doesn't necessarily rule it out.
Now, that's interesting, and kind of brings me to another question I had was, I know, like I've had gut dysbiosis that was pretty much asymptomatic aside from, bloating and things that are so common that it was hard to really go, okay, I'm having a major gut issue. Can you talk to us a little bit about symptoms? Like, how do we know if we're having a gut health issue? Are there specific symptoms we should look for that maybe might be surprising, or even just, what are the basic symptoms? Then what do you see? How often are gut issues asymptomatic and things like that?
Oh, sure. Yeah, we can segue into that, and I can loop back to some of the stuff about what else is contained on the test. But yeah, so like, why would we want to test, and who should we test? So the obvious, when we're having a conversation about stool testing, what's obvious is that some people have obvious digestive related symptoms. So this is going to be things that fall into the realm of irritable bowel, right? So ongoing diarrhea or loose stool, or constipation, or varying back and forth. Abdominal pain or bloating, nausea or vomiting, gas, ulcers, those kinds of things that are quite clearly digestive. But then there's a whole bunch of other reasons we would want to run stool testing. And these are like my favorite places to talk about, because this is the category I fell into. I didn't necessarily, for the majority of my life, didn't have necessarily strong IBS symptoms or things that made me think, oh, I definitely have a gut problem. But I really couldn't get a handle on my hormonal related symptoms until I took a deep look at the gut. And so that's a really key piece, is that they're so closely tied. So really this would be, anybody who has autoimmunity, known autoimmunity, anybody who has extreme fatigue, nutritional deficiencies, like perpetually having low B12 or iron status or anemias, brain fog, depression, sugar cravings, anxiety, joint pain, things like skin conditions like psoriasis or eczema or rosacea, obesity, diabetes, and then things like food intolerances, especially when you're constantly developing new sensitivities. And then outside of that, anybody with hormone concerns. So people with, especially in the realm of thyroid, of course, anyone with Hashimoto's or any form of autoimmune thyroid, but also anyone who has thyroid conversion issues, where they have suboptimal T3 or free T3, but normal or higher looking other markers. And then anybody with things like endometriosis or fertility concerns, PCOS. So really there's a whole realm of other things that are outside the gut that would make you think about why you would want to test your gut, even if you don't really have clear digestive related symptoms.
Well, and watching the research come out, it's like there's more and more and more about our health that is related to our gut health and our microbiome, which is just fascinating. I mean, listening to all the different issues that, you just listed that could indicate some, connection to our gut health. It's like, wow. And I know for me, in addressing and taking my gut health more seriously and nurturing my gut, doing things, changing my diet to avoid inflammatory foods, or, taking a probiotic, drinking things like bone broth, just doing those things that help protect and nurture and heal my gut, has gotten rid of a lot of symptoms. Like before, my before and after with my gut health picture was before I was sick all the time. I would get, a cold, and that would turn into strep throat and tonsillitis and laryngitis. And I couldn't get well. And as soon as I started addressing those things, I felt like my whole immune system was working better. And that's a big one with our gut health, right? Is our immunity is so tied to our gut health. Can you talk about that a little bit?
Absolutely. So, I experienced something similar to what you experienced, which was that prior to clearing a couple pathogens that I had in the gut, I was kind of always getting sick. And of course, I was doing some other things health-wise, so it wasn't maybe just only that piece, but distinctly when I cleared those things, I went from having, 5 upper respiratory illnesses per winter to like maybe having one, and then had some years having none. So I can relate to what you experienced as well.
Same. What
So
about energy? Did you feel a lot more energy? Because that was my experience. Once I targeted these specific pathogens, it was like, boom, I
absolutely.
have energy again. And it had been years. I think, that's why I was saying, like, it's easy to think we're asymptomatic because we get used to being a
Mm-hmm.
little bloated, being tired a
Mm-hmm.
lot, being sick a lot. And then we're
Mhm.
like, this is just normal, right? Well, maybe it's
Yeah.
not. Maybe it's not.
Mm. Absolutely common, but not normal. So what I think about it, like, I think about it, there's this analogy I have to like the apps that are running in the background on your smartphone, and you have to like double click and swipe up to like free up some of the bandwidth, if you have too many things running in the background. Well, it's like
Mhm.
that. We're not seeing them front and center, but these things are running 24 hours a day, kind of doing their thing and taking up some of our bandwidth or our chi, right? And so
Mhm.
yeah, absolutely. I see energy go up. And, the immune thing we were talking about, as well as the energy levels, often tie back to the connection between the gut and the adrenals. So, one of the markers on stool panels that I'll often use as like a red flag for that is called Secretory Iga or SIG-A. And that's an immunoglobulin it's a marker of gut secretory immunity and barrier function in the gut. And when it gets out of balance, either super low or super high, it can indicate there's a loss of resilience, loss of tolerance. So that will often happen either because there's a chronic infection in the gut or because of immune suppression from some other reason. Or just because of somebody having dysregulated cortisol levels, you can have a nosedive in this SIG-A, because essentially when the body thinks that you're under stress or taxed, it prioritizes where it sends its resources. And your immune system can kind of take a back seat, is what the body thinks, because, you're probably not going to, I guess evolutionarily, it was like you're going to have to outrun the bear right now. You're not going to die of an infection until tomorrow. So your immune
Mm-hmm.
system can wait.
Mm.
Kind of like that, it's order of priority. And
Mhm.
so what happens is that we have SIG-A not just in the gut, we also have it in the lungs, the sinus, the urinary tract, anywhere we have mucosal membranes. And so we become more vulnerable there when that immunity is suppressed. And then it's a two-way street. So basically we have these, the apps running, or AKA these dysbiosis in the gut that are they cause inflammation, and that inflammation then disrupts the signaling, or it acts as a stressor back to our adrenal cascade, and keeps it in a chronic stress state, which can shift those cortisol levels. And then vice versa, when you have chronically shifted cortisol levels, it will lead to a suppression of that immunity. So there's a whole bunch of ways that those feed back to each other.
Mhm. It
And
sounds like a vicious cycle.
one of the things that really kind of brings it all together for me and makes it really simple to like visualize, I'm a visual learner, is imagining your gut like a garden, and they say this all the time, like what would you do for a garden? What would you do to make your plants grow and pretty and bloom? And you would take care of it, right? And if it was withering away, I mean, it would be this obvious thing, and people just don't
Mhm.
really associate their gut like they should, because you can't really see it, right? Like you can see your garden, you walk outside, you're like, oh no, it needs water, or oh no, right? But you
Mhm.
don't do that, and you walk around with it every day. So to use that analogy really helps me be thinking, what am I blooming? Am I growing? Am I,
Mhm.
evolving? What am I doing with my garden today?
Are the weeds taking over and choking
Yeah,
out the
right,
flowers? I
right.
love that analogy.
Seriously.
That's awesome. Well, I was curious, Brie, when you're meeting with clients, how do you know what tests to ask for? You mentioned the GI map, and there's other, it sounds like you can get really fine-tuned with what kind of GI testing you do. Is there any
You
way that you're able to decipher, instead of just like taking like that broad um, view, or is that sort of your approach, or what do you recommend, I guess?
Well, so there's a couple different ways you would think about this, but basically the panels that really are much more accurate than, say, like going after a single organism, like, oh, we're just gonna test, well, there's reasons you would do that, but for say example, just testing for H. pylori with a breath test or something. So the stool panels are going to have like higher accuracy. They're also, you know, you're going to test for a host of different organisms that could be considered pathogenic. And so, you know, we can't really, based on symptoms, know what you might have going on. We can suspect, we can have certain suspicions. And I do see certain patterns. For example, if someone has gut issues but also has hives and Hashimoto's, I'm going to suspect strongly that they might have blastocystis hominis show up, but they might also have a bunch of friends in there at the party. So we kind of need to see all of who's in there, especially when you're thinking about kind of clearing out, like in that garden analogy, weeding and seeding, right? So who are you taking out that are the bad guys? So really, I think it's best for everybody to start with one of these stool panels. Some of the ones on the market are like I mentioned the GI Maps by Diagnostic Solutions. Dr. Stata recently came out with a comparable panel called the GI 360. Microbiome Labs recently launched Biome FX, which has like, you know, kind of additional things. Those are some of the stool, and then there's Genova's panel, which is the GI effects. And so all of those have, you know, similar things they look at, and they just use slightly different technologies. And I feel some are more accurate for my purposes than others, but other practitioners might have a preference there too. So generally, we're going to start with a stool panel. And then if someone also has chronic constipation or chronic diarrhea or really strong levels of bloating, that's going to lead me to think, okay, should we test for Sibo? I'm also going to think if they have a history of food poisoning to run testing for Sibo. And then there's a couple of other things, one of which is Hashimoto's, because there's such high correlations in the research. But also like interstitial cystitis and restless leg are very specific conditions that have high associations with Sibo, even with low, kind of minor Sibo symptoms. So I'll run Sibo testing, and you can't tell if someone has Sibo from a stool panel. You can kind of get some hints that might be happening, but really to assess Sibo, you need to do a breath test. Usually we recommend lactulose, although lactulose or glucose are substrates that you would drink and then blow into these tubes at certain time intervals over a course of 2 or 3 hours. And then the printout that you get, the report, shows the gas levels that come out in the breath. And there are certain gases that are not made by human cellular metabolism. They're only made by the presence of the bacteria. And so we're able to see if there's higher levels of bacteria in the small intestine than there should be. So that would be Sibo testing. And then Candida is another common pathogen that I'm going to look at, especially with anybody with thyroid or hormone issues, because, you know, like what I'll tell you is that most of my clients who fall into the Hashimoto's umbrella are going to have Candida. Like that's just going to be present. They're often going to have, you know, symptoms like gas and bloating, and maybe they're going to have, you know, maybe skin rashes, maybe repeat vaginal infections. There's a whole bunch of ways that can look. But so the thing is that Candida is one of those sneaky microbes. It's a yeast or fungi, and it's present in the healthy microbiome in regular amounts, but when it overgrows is when it becomes problematic. And that doesn't always show on a stool panel consistently. There's a couple reasons for that, but one of which is that if it's in the colon, we're going to tend to see it in the stool sample much more readily than if Candida exists higher up in the GI tract, like in the upper part of the small intestine or say the esophagus. It's not always going to shed in the stool. There's a couple other reasons as well, but that's a big one. And so I'll suspect Candida if we have a relevant history and symptoms. So if someone's used multiple rounds of antibiotics, or especially broad spectrum ones, or multiple rounds of antibiotics over the years, IV antibiotics or long-term prescriptions of them, if they tell me they have a history of vaginal yeast infections or like itching in the groin a lot, chronic urinary tract infections or interstitial cystitis, fungal toenails, or they're reactive to yeast, any of the above GI issues we mentioned, then, or if they already have a pre-existing diagnosis of methane type Sibo, if they have strong carb and sugar cravings or real stubborn weight issues, I'm going to dig a little deeper. So I'll look on the stool panel, but I'll also, if it doesn't show up there, I might run organic acid testing and look for there's markers of Candida that can be found there, or I may run serum antibodies to Candida to see if that suggests that there's a immune reactivity to a existing Candida.
Candida is a big one, and Sibo as well. I just want to mention for our listeners that's small intestine bacterial overgrowth. Is that correct?
Yeah, that is. Yes.
So further up the intestinal tract.
Yes, further up the intestinal tract, right? That's when we should have trillions of bacteria in our colon, but we should have relatively few bacteria in our small intestine. That's where we do most of our digesting and absorbing of nutrients. And when, for a number of number of reasons, people can develop overgrowth of these bacteria in their small intestine, and that can create inflammation and leaky gut and interfere with the absorption and digestion of nutrients. And it's actually present in up to 54% of people with hypothyroidism, and is notable for depleting iron. And iron is involved in thyroid hormone synthesis. And part of that is because thyroid hormones are involved in regulating the motility of the gut. And so one of the things that will trigger SIBO is when we have a sluggish, what's called migrating motor complex, or basically when the neurologic innervation that makes our small waves of peristalsis in the gut not work as well. Then we'll have food sit in the small intestine larger, particles of undigested food, instead of being swept down into the colon, and that allows for bacteria to ferment them and grow, or for yeast to ferment them and grow. So that's kind of couple of the connections there between thyroid and SIBO.
I'm working on an article for us right now on ginger, and was reading about how ginger can help with that, increasing that gut motility. Does that agree with your research?
Absolutely. We use ginger a lot in people who it's appropriate for as what's called a prokinetic. So, without diving too deep into the treatment of SIBO, one of the things you do when you're working with SIBO is to restore that peristalsis. That's critical to help restore it. And there can be a lot of reasons why it's off, but one of the tools you use is to use an appropriate prokinetic, and ginger is one of them, or one of the ingredients that might be in some of the prokinetic formulas we use.
And peristalsis, that's like just the way that your digestive tract sort of contracts and moves the food through the tube. Is that right?
Yeah, exactly. It's like people at a hockey game doing the wave in the stands.
Right.
That's peristalsis, but like transfer that to the smooth muscle of your gut, and that's how things are swept forward down the tube.
Okay. So do the villi also play a role in peristalsis? Just to get nerdy for a minute.
Well, I believe that, so basically they're not like, it's really the muscle that's contracting, but the villi are also moving. And so because they're kind of finger-like, they wind up sweeping things along as well. But I don't believe that they have their own control mechanism, but
right.
I'd have to actually kind of look that up to be real 100% sure on that.
This is so fascinating. I mean, the gut is just, it's like cooking. You can never know everything about the gut. It seems like,
endless.
Yes. Thank you so much, Brie, for sharing this. Was there any other things, certain gut infections you wanted to cover that might be common to thyroid patients besides Candida and SIBO?
Absolutely. I think these are so important to know about. So there's like 4 or 5 big ones. So one of them I already mentioned is called blastocystis hominis. And why I really want people to know about this is that in some of the research literature, especially out of Southeast Asia, the assumption is that blastocystis is not considered a pathogen. And that's true in some ways, because some people can have blastocystis and not have it create a bunch of symptoms, or at least symptoms in the research that are related to gut health. So that's a real big one. But some people have blasto and it can cause bloating and diarrhea or variable bowel habits or pain. Hives, I mentioned, is common, and fatigue. And that pathogen is notorious for promoting multiple food sensitivities. So usually when you have a food sensitivity, you stop eating that food, and then, you go about eating, and we don't expect to just keep developing new sensitivities, but there's certain pathogens that can kind of perpetuate that, where now we're developing a new one and a new one. And so anyway, there's a big correlation with Hashimoto's and blastocystis. So people with Hashimoto's are more likely to develop IBS. It can be related to blastocystis. It can be related to other infections, but there's been studies where people who had IBS and also had chronic hives, a huge percentage, like over 61%, had blastocystis hominis. And then, there was almost none of it in the healthy controls. So
pretty high,
it's a
right?
common one, really high. That's really common. There's a bacteria called Yersinia, and Yersinia enterocolítica is also associated with autoimmune thyroid disorders, both Graves and Hashimoto's, and in susceptible individuals. So if you have higher levels of antibodies to that organism, that's often found in people who also have autoimmune thyroid disorder. So that's one we look for. H. pylori can act as a trigger, Helicobacter pylori, and that's another one that can be pathogenic or not. And it's also the organism that we attribute to being responsible for gastric ulcers, usually in most cases. The Epstein-Barr virus in this study was found to be present in the cells of the thyroid gland in 80% of people that they tested who were known to have Hashimoto's. And in the people who they tested as the controls who didn't have Hashimoto's, they did not have Epstein-Barr virus in their thyroid gland.
Wow, that's incredible.
So that's one I'm always looking for in various ways, but it can show up in stool panels that test for it. And then the last one, this is kind of interesting and a little bit lesser known, is Giardia. So Giardia, and there's some studies that have shown that basically that infection with Giardia, so they showed that there was infection and they did that by biopsy. So you can't really refute biopsy, like it's there or it's not. And that when they treated the Giardia and the parasite was shown to be eliminated, there was a recovery of the thyroid hormone absorption in the gut. So this was someone who was on supplemental levothyroxine. And so some of this also is not just like, is it causing the issue, but like if you are taking thyroid replacement, which is, one of the most, it's the most common prescription in the United States, that if you have some of these organisms, they can create a scenario in the gut where you're not effectively absorbing your medication, right? So I'm not sure that those results that we're seeing were specific to Giardia, even though that was the organism being looked at. I think that many organisms could do that. Many parasites could do the same thing.
Well, I know we hear from so many people in our community who deal with these things where they're like, why am I not converting my medication? Why is my medication no longer working for me? How come I've eliminated all these foods and I still am getting more and more and more food sensitivities and things like that? And I think it just underlines the importance, guys, of test, don't guess.
Right?
Reach out to your
Absolutely.
healthcare practitioner, work with someone like Brie, find a naturopath or a functional MD or whoever you need to find who can offer these tests and who can help you interpret them, because I think it's really clear this isn't a do-it-yourself project. You really need someone to help you determine what tests do we need and what do the results mean, so that we can put the puzzle pieces together, because it isn't always obvious that oh, I'm tired and sick all the time, I must have a overgrowth of dysbiotic gut flora. It's sort of counterintuitive in many ways, but I did a major, I had a gut project this year. This was one of my healing projects to deal with some chronic Candida and addressing biofilms, which is probably a topic for a whole nother show, but these films that can, form in your digestive tract that hide and house and protect certain pathogens. And if you can't break those biofilms down, they just continue to live inside you. And it was quite a process, and I'm starting to really feel some major benefits of the work that I did there. So it can really, I know personally, I can't say enough how important gut health is. And with our amazing family of contributors, including you, Over and over, we hear this, don't we, Danna? I mean, gut health, gut health, gut health. Look at your gut health, nurture your gut health,
right?
protect it.
Ginny, right?
Yeah. I mean, you've
Absolutely.
had your own story with it. So thank you so much for sharing with us, Brie. And before we sign off, we'll let people know at the end here how they can connect with you. But I just wondered if you had anything else to add as far as, just takeaways for the listeners today.
The one last thought I have is just to make sure that test don't guesses, right? But also get the right testing. Because the one last thing I'll say is that I have so many people who say, well, I went to my doctor and they ran a stool panel and they didn't find anything. Or I got tested for H. pylori, I had the breath test, I didn't find anything. And what I'll say is that go get those tests from, and what I'm talking about is like your regular allopathic physician who's like at a mainstream medical group and isn't using necessarily a lab that really just specializes in stool tests. The way those are run is often just by microscopy, meaning somebody sitting there in a lab looking under a microscope to see what they find or don't find. And versus a lot of these other technologies work with identifying the DNA or RNA sequences of these specific organisms, and they're done in labs that really are just constantly calibrating their machines, and all they do is this day in and day out. And a lot of those stool panels that you'll get, for pathogens from your regular doctor won't really look at the microbiome. They're just looking for like a couple of main known pathogens, Giardia, H. pylori, something like that, maybe blastocystis. And occasionally they'll find something. So it's not that they have zero value. If they find something, it's there. But they don't really have the nuance and the depth of information to tell us more information about those organisms, to really look at. They often miss things that are there, and they won't tell us about the context. So context is important as well, because when we work with the results of the panels, it's not always about just like kill the bad guy. It's about, in who, meaning like you have to look at the, it's not uncommon to have a small number of pathogens present in your microbiome, but the relative abundance in proportion to your other bacteria and is what's important as well, which is a whole nother topic. So I would just say the right testing matters.
Yeah, I appreciate you mentioning that, because I know the first question on people's tongues is always, will my MD do this? Will insurance cover this? And yes,
exactly.
That is a sort of a common roadblock people run into, where, their MDs or general physicians may do a few tests for a few things, but these complete panels are typically someone you're going to have to go to a whole health practitioner for.
Absolutely.
And that is unfortunately often out of pocket for most of us. But, talk about making an investment in your health. I know it's been life-changing for me and for plenty of people in our community to do some of this exploring into what's really going on in our gut. So thank you so much again, Brie, for sharing your wisdom and knowledge with us today on this fascinating topic.
Thank you for having me. It was wonderful to talk with you guys, and I hope this is helpful to some of your audience.
Oh, I'm sure it'll be helpful to tons of the audience. Majority, right?
Definitely. Yes, the majority.
Thank you all for joining us for another episode of Thyroid Refresh TV, where we give you the inspiration and information you need to make the best choices for your health. For our listeners, you can find Brie Wieselman online at briewieselman.com. We will make sure and put that link in the show notes. And Brie, you have some free resources that might be helpful to people with digestive issues. Can you tell us about those real quick?
I do. Yeah, I have a whole number of free resources, but the two that are related to gut issues. One of them is my general basic digestive health information handout, and that's just a great place for anyone who has gut symptoms to start. It's a very like rubber meets the road. Here's what you can do now, and here's some of the things you might not have been told before. And that you can get either by going to the homepage of my website, or you can get that in the I'll provide the link for that for you guys. And then also we have a Sibo Guidebook that I put together because I had so many questions all the time about Sibo. What is it? How do we get it? What do we do about it? What don't we do about it? what to expect. And so that is also something that people can download. I'll give you a link for that.
And if any of you would like to receive a free Thyroid Thrivers grocery guide, you can visit us at thyroidrefresh.com. And to learn more about Thyroid 30, you can go to thyroidrefresh.com/thyroid30. Never forget, you do have the power to heal, and we have the tools.
And if you've enjoyed this podcast and would like to help us continue inspiring and empowering thyroid patients worldwide, please leave us a review on iTunes. It would make our day. You are what makes this community the amazing resource that it is, and we truly, truly appreciate your listenership and your support. We're Danna and Ginny, wishing you the best of health. See you guys next time.
See you next time.